Well, thank you very much, Julie, for that nice introduction. As a payback, I'll do exactly what you asked me to do, and that is wish happy birthday to Nazali Topalian and ask her please to stand. As I understand it, Nazali is Julie's roommate, and a surprise party planned for yesterday didn't come off quite as expected, and so we surprised her today. I also appreciate Julie's testing out this little platform on which I'm standing. Nobody ever believes how short I am. And so I arrive and I can never see the front table over the podium, and then at the last minute there's a rush around to get something to stand on. This is made of cardboard, and if I disappear suddenly, you'll know it wasn't made of sturdy cardboard. Once when I was home in Wyoming giving a speech, I stood on my briefcase because I couldn't see over the podium. And the photographer from the local paper took a full-length picture of me standing on the briefcase. And the next morning, my hometown paper ran this picture with the caption, "Elevated Remarks," which I think is a little unkind. But I appreciate Julie giving the audience here today something of an idea of what the National Endowment for the Humanities does, because we are a bit of a mystery. I spent a lot of time explaining this long title, National Endowment for the Humanities, and I suppose most of my time is spent explaining humanities. This seems a rather mysterious term to many people. I'm reminded constantly of how mysterious it is by the mail I get, misaddressed in wonderful ways. I received a letter not long ago addressed to the National Endowment for the Amenities. Isn't that nice? Well, I am on your program today. It says that I'm going to speak about academic freedom, and I sort of will. I mean, you have to understand how these speech titles come about. Between the time I get an invitation and the time I actually make the speech, it's a long time passes. And usually several weeks into that, I start getting frantic phone calls from whoever is in charge of the program saying, "What's she going to talk about?" That comes through my secretary. "What's she going to talk about?" So my secretary comes in and starts bothering me. "What are you going to talk about? What are you going to talk about?" Well, I don't know. I haven't written the speech. I don't do it till the last minute. I probably shouldn't confess this, but I suppose like most of you, I wait till the last minute. So there's this poor person on the other end of the phone, and there's my secretary in the middle, and I can't decide what. So I usually just make up a topic, and I say, tell them I'll talk about academic freedom. And then when the time comes to sit down and write the speech, I sort of focus in on that, but I often will find some other angle on it that's even more interesting than the direct approach. So I will talk about academic freedom today. But I'm going to come at it from an obtuse angle, I suppose you might say. Because when I sat down to write a speech, it occurred to me that academic freedom is indeed severely threatened on many of our college campuses. But that the threat to academic freedom is caught up in other matters, in other problems that are plaguing both our colleges and our universities. You know, this idea that our universities and colleges do have trouble, do have problems, is a fairly new one. When I came to the endowment 6 years ago, when I first became chairman, it was widely conceded that our schools were in trouble. But it was thought that our colleges and universities were institutions we could point to with a great deal of pride. And then 5 years ago, Alan Bloom's book was published. And since then, there has been a flood of publications, articles, books by people who are on the left side of the spectrum, and the center of the spectrum, and on the right. Sometimes people portray the writers of these critiques of higher education as though they were all conservative, but indeed not. Some of the people who have been writing books, for example, and articles, Eugene Genovese at the University of Georgia, a man who describes himself as a Marxist historian. C. Van Woodward, a noted emeritus scholar at Yale. Page Smith. These are people whom I do not suspect of ever having voted for a Republican president. There are also people on the other side of the spectrum, but it's a problem the problems of our colleges and universities are being widely acknowledged. There was a Harris poll not long ago that showed that the lowest percentage ever since this poll has been taken, 25 years now, the number of people willing to express high confidence in the leadership of our colleges and universities is at its lowest point ever. 21%, down from 35% last year. I suppose in the interest of fairness, I have to point out that that is not nearly as low as the Congress. It is not nearly as low as Wall Street, not nearly as low as the people who run political campaigns. But it is right down there with the television news. And I think that's something new. Well, the litany of complaints coming out of all these books and articles is a familiar one. Faculty members who don't teach, students who don't learn, and I think, most serious of all, politics everywhere, from the scholarly journals to the classrooms. Now, I know there are people, and I suspect some in this audience, who think these charges are wildly exaggerated, and I think probably from time to time they have been. And I know that these problems don't exist with the same intensity at every institution. Sometimes, when I am told, well, we don't have those problems here, sometimes it's true. But these problems are very real, and they are very hard to solve, and so it is important that we surface them. If you just focus for a minute on the problem of college teaching and find a single institution where teaching is not being paid as much attention to as it should be, even once you've identified the problem, it's very difficult to decide how to fix it, because there's nobody at that institution that you can point your finger at and say, this person, this group is to blame. If a single institution isn't paying enough attention to teaching, it's not the fault of the faculty. It seems obvious that it would be, but it's not necessarily their fault. It's not even the fault of administrators, and everyone likes to blame everything on the administrators. The problem is that all of these people are caught up in a reward system that stretches across the nation, in a reward system that values research, that values publication, that values faculty members making themselves known through research and publication, and that does not place much value on teaching. For a single individual, for a single faculty member to move in another direction, to decide that he or she is going to pay as much attention to students as often that faculty member wants to. For a single institution, for a college or university to decide that students will be the focus, that is a very hard decision to make. Once a year, U.S. News and World Report will rank you, and those rankings reflect research. U.S. News and World Report will try to tell you they don't reflect research totally, but they do. And so you'll find that if you're an individual, if you're an institution, and you focus on teaching, your prestige diminishes. One of the results of this, of course, is a lot of second-rate teaching. The goal of full-time faculty members is all too often to get out of the classroom, to turn teaching over to someone else, graduate students, part-timers. Necessary stints in the classroom are made more palatable by focusing them on the professor's publication interests rather than the student's intellectual needs. It's not uncommon to find undergraduates who've read very little literature studying the latest literary theories, sophomores who haven't read Shakespeare studying Lacan and Foucault. In one section of an introductory political science course offered at a university near Washington, D.C., Johns Hopkins, students who have probably never read the most basic works of political science are spending their time watching films. Do the Right Thing, Platoon, The Times of Harvey Milk. There are good people on our campuses, teachers who despair about this situation, but they frequently find themselves powerless to do anything about it. Even if they are able to get a good, sound core curriculum in place, even if they were able to do that, who would teach it? It is not in the interests of faculty members whose careers are advanced by focusing on narrow areas, doing research and publishing. It's not in the interests of people who see that their careers advance that way to undertake the broad-ranged reading and study that general education courses require. So, the primacy of research on our campuses results in a lot of second-rate teaching, and it also results in a lot of second-rate research. A few years ago, I visited a state university in the East, and the assistant professor who was assigned to drive me around for that day confessed to me that what he really loved was teaching. He wasn't really interested in research. It was hard to get to good libraries from where he was. He really loved teaching, but he was spending as much time as he could churning out articles because he knew that's what he had to do. He also knew, he said to me, that what he was doing wasn't all that great, but his profession required him to do it. Well, if you multiply that story thousands of times, you begin to understand why our university, college budgets, why our library shelves are groaning under the weight of articles and books that nobody reads. There was a professor recently, a scientist, who did what he called a study of uncitedness. Now what he did was he looked at articles, and then he analyzed how many times in the 4 years after that article was published, how many times someone else cited it in a footnote. And what he found is that in the biological sciences, at the end of 4 years, 41% of the articles articles published remained uncited. That's in the biological sciences. In the social sciences, the rate of uncitedness rose to 75%. And in the humanities, I am sorry to say, to 98%. Now there is, of course, excellent research being done. We are funding excellent research at the Endowment. Much of this research is directed at bringing to light, at helping us know more about people who we didn't pay enough attention to in the past, women, minorities. I think of Henry Louis Gates's project on black periodical literature, bringing to light literature we didn't even know existed 20 years ago. Or some of the work that's being done to collect the papers of notable American women, people like Jane Addams, people like Frances Willard. There's a project going on right now in Guatemala, of which I'm very proud, excavations of Maya culture that are absolutely transforming the way we think about the Maya and providing interesting information for us today. The Maya managed to support large populations in the tropical rainforest. Today we don't know how to do that. If we can learn how the Maya did it, perhaps we can benefit the people living in the Guatemalan lowlands today. So there's good research going on. And it's possible to learn about this research from reading your newspapers, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, papers all in between, write about this project in Guatemala. Arthur Demarest is the archaeologist. But they also cover, and you can't blame them, they also cover the latest goings-on at the Modern Language Association every year. One of the largest scholarly organizations have a convention every year where papers are presented on such topics as Jane Austen and the Masturbating Girl, and these are actual titles, Is Alice Still in Phallus Land? Making scholarship seem as shocking and titillating as possible does little to help convince people that the scholarly enterprise is worth supporting. None of this, however, damages the reputation of our colleges and universities as much as does the politicized classroom. And I know that over the past few years you've heard a lot about this. You've heard about it as part of the political correctness syndrome. I heard so much about political correctness, there's even a little backlash building. A group of scholars has formed to prove to the world that not only is PC dead, it never existed. But at the same time this group is operating, people on our campuses are making it clear that teaching is being politicized as never before. At that Modern Language Association convention this year, one paper, professor from the University of Texas at Austin, her paper was on, and this is a quote, "The task of the politically committed cultural worker in today's university." Another professor from the University of California at San Diego urged her fellow professors to, and I quote, "disrupt our students' ideas of inevitable capitalism." A faculty member from Columbia University felt obliged to issue warnings that awareness of cultural difference might possibly be useful to American business. Her nightmare was that companies such as Coca-Cola, becoming wiser about cultural differences, might become more effective at marketing their products. And she urged her assembled colleagues to find ways of teaching about cultural difference that could not be, and I quote, appropriated by late capitalism. In the last few years, people intent on using the classroom and the curriculum to advance a political agenda have become very frank about what they're doing. In an article in Harvard Educational Review, a recent article, a professor at the University of Wisconsin rejects the code words, such as critical pedagogy, that have often been used to veil politicized teaching. She insists that professors like herself be open about their intention. And this is what she identifies it as, and this is a quote: to appropriate public resources, classrooms, school supplies, teacher-professor salaries, academic requirements, and degrees, to appropriate these resources to further progressive political agendas. The course that this professor was writing about in Harvard Educational Review that she's taught at the University of Wisconsin is called, it's a very innocuous title, Curriculum and Instruction 607. But its purpose is anything but innocuous. Its purpose is to teach students how to demonstrate. And once they have learned how to demonstrate, they actually conduct demonstrations on the campus. The professor describes it this way: we interrupt business as usual, that is, the social relations of racism, sexism, classism, and Eurocentrism as usual, in the public spaces of the library, mall, and the administrative offices. Well, now, students used to do this when I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. They did this, they demonstrated. That's okay, but nobody thought of giving them 3 hours credit for it. I don't mean to bore you with long quotes, but I think it's important for good citizens in the heartland of our country to understand what is happening. This is from College English. Now, College English is not a radical publication. It's the publication of the National Council of Teachers of English. And this is a professor from California who's quite clear about the fact that there's no longer any question about whether you should use the classroom to advance a political agenda. That's settled. The only question is how you do it effectively, he says, and you have to calibrate your strategy. You don't want to do it the same way at an elite university as you do at a community college. So he says this is his strategy for the institution he teaches at. He defines it as a middle-class institution. Listen to this quote. The best starting point, he writes, is to challenge students' conditioned belief in their freedom of choice and mobility within American society by bringing them to a critical awareness of the constrictions in their own class position. Under the rhetorical topic of learning to examine viewpoints different from their own, they can be exposed to sources delineating the gross inequities between the upper class and themselves, the odds against their attaining room at the top, the way their education has channeled them toward mid-level professional and social slots and conditioned them into authoritarian conformity. They can be exposed to sources showing their manipulation by the elites, controlling big business, mass politics, media, and consumership, in large part through the rhetoric of public doublespeak. Well, this is a faculty member intent on converting students to his point of view. He has no intention of introducing them to other perspectives. He wants students to share his conviction that our society is a closed and class-ridden one, and he's doing this under the guise of teaching students how to write. This is an approach to teaching and an ethic that could hardly be more different from the way faculty members have traditionally regarded their responsibilities in the classroom. It represents an entirely new attitude towards students and their rights. It used to be thought that students had what the American Association of University Professors calls freedom to learn. They didn't come to college or university to be indoctrinated. They came to learn a variety of views on a host of subjects, to test their thoughts against the great ideas of the ages, to challenge these ideas, to contest them, and ultimately, enlightened by the contest, to discover what they believed. But students who find themselves in a classroom where the professor has political intention aren't likely to have this kind of experience. For one thing, having the kind of experience that we used to think college was about means that professors have to have an attitude of generosity toward their students. They have to understand that it's unequal. Ideas that are half-formed have to be encouraged, perhaps better stated. This isn't going to happen in a classroom where there's political intention. Can you imagine the professor, the one in California, who wants students to understand how they're victims of big business and big media? Can you imagine his helping a student who wants to formulate a case for free markets? You can't imagine it. Well, I tell you about these things because I think that of all the things going on in our college and university campuses, all the things that are potentially damaging, this is the most. It's not only damaging in the sense that it acts against that it acts against what we've always thought a college education to be about. It acts against what we've thought colleges and universities themselves to be about. If you look across the country, what you see are mottos directed toward the truth. It's Veritas at Harvard, I think, Lux at Veritas at Yale, at Indiana. Whatever things are true, whatsoever things are true. Truth used to be set up as the goal of education. John Dewey once said, the function of the university is the truth function. But those who want to politicize the classroom have a new argument. The argument is that there is no truth. There's only your view and my view. And I know that the reaction to what I'm saying today will be something like this. Well, Mrs. Cheney, there's just your politics and my politics, and I've decided to teach my politics in the classroom. This is an argument that has a kernel of truth in it. There is a sense in which we are all political all the time. It's political, though, defined in the most innocuous way possible. It's political, meaning that it's very hard for me to get completely outside my skin. I try very hard, but it's hard for me to do that. So it's political defined in this broad sense. But then the argument, it's kind of a shell game. The argument changes to a different kind of politics. Well, Mrs. Cheney, you're political, I'm political, we're all political all the time, so I'm going to teach my politics in the classroom. But that's politics with a large P, as opposed to this other kind of politics, which is just about the fact that you and I have very great difficulty escaping from our experiences when we have choices to make. This is a familiar critique. Philosophers have never thought that truth was an easy subject to deal with. Scholars have long understood that it's very difficult for people to overcome their experiences when they make judgments. These are familiar ideas. But what we have now is this familiar critique carried to a kind of extreme position. And as an idea of how extreme it can be, let me read you a passage that was written recently by two historians at the University of Pennsylvania. Their argument is that we shouldn't judge historians by the evidence they cite or the way they use it. Because, and this is the quote, we are all engaged, all historians, in writing a kind of propaganda. Rather than believe in the absolute truth of what we are writing, we must believe in the moral or political position we are taking with it. Historians should assess an argument on the basis of its persuasiveness, its political utility, and its political sincerity. We can't know the truth, in other words, and that was the end of the quote. We can't know the truth, in other words, so we should forget about the pursuit of it. Forget about it in scholarship, forget about it in the classroom, and forget about it in life, and advance whatever is politically useful. Well, my counter-argument is that this is nonsense. The fact that we aren't omniscient and we can't know everything doesn't mean we shouldn't try to seek the truth. And the fact that it's hard for us to get outside our skins doesn't mean we should quit trying to be objective. To argue that we should base a college education on political expediency brings us right into the world, it seems to me, of George Orwell, 1984, where it was said 2 and 2 make 5 if it's politically useful. Now, I've talked about this topic before, so now I not only know what the philosophical arguments coming back are, I know there are going to be some of you out there who say, oh, Mrs. Cheney, you're just worried too much about this. It's a little thing, and you're making it a big thing. You're worrying too much about it. But I have to tell you, it's hard to over-worry when I come across a really imperturbable fellow, Louis Menand at City University of New York, writing as he did a few months ago in Harper's Weekly, that, and this is the quote, it is now regarded as legitimate by some professors to argue that the absence of political intention or a multicultural focus in another professor's work constitutes prima facie disqualification for professional advancement. If you are not political, you do not advance. Another variation on the you're worrying too much about it, Mrs. Cheney, goes like this. Look, Mrs. Cheney, the center and the right control most of society. What do you care if the left controls the English departments? Well, frankly, I don't care who controls the English departments. I don't care what the politics of the people in the English department are. I don't think any of us should care about that. What does concern me is the classroom being used for political purpose. Not because I think many students are convinced. I don't think many conversions happen. If you look at the political affiliations among young people, it seems to argue just the opposite, in fact. I don't think many conversions happen. The price that's paid is intellectual. It's not that kids come out believing things different from going in, but the price is intellectual. What they're deprived of is that wonderful exchange, that free exchange of ideas that gives them some notion of how exciting the life of the mind can be. They're deprived of opportunities to know wherein the real excitement of learning lies. Now, there are probably a lot of you here who are in fields outside the humanities, mathematics, maybe engineering, and I'm sure you're thinking this has nothing to do with you. Well, it started in the humanities, but let me tell you, it's heading your way. I've been reading books on feminist science lately. One that I came across recently postulates this whole idea of objectivity that we talked about a minute ago. You know, you can't be objective, you can't get out of your skin. The idea of objectivity, it is said, is a parochial one. Parochial one influenced by a particular ideology about gender. Think about that. The whole idea of objectivity is somehow gender related. Politicized teaching is also making its way into our schools. I know some of you are familiar with Arthur Schlesinger's work. Arthur Schlesinger, let me be clear about this, is hardly a conservative. He's been very, very concerned about our schools being used to advance ideas that are not based on evidence. And that's what we're talking about, having evidence in the classroom. He offers as one example the 11th grade American history curriculum in New York State, which flatly declares that there were 3 influences on the United States Constitution. 1, the antecedent colonial experience. 2, the European Enlightenment. And 3, the Haudenosaunee political system. Schlesinger goes on to observe, whatever influenced the Iroquois Confederation, and that's the Haudenosaunee political system, whatever influence the Iroquois Confederation may have had on the framers of the Constitution was marginal. On European intellectuals, it was marginal to the point of invisibility. No other state curriculum offers this analysis of the making of the Constitution, but then no other state has so effective an Iroquois lobby. Al Shanker, American Federation of Teachers, has spoken out very bravely and frankly about Afrocentric curricula, noting how often they are not based on fact. The Portland baseline essays, which are used in schools across the country trying to establish Afrocentric curricula, contain myths that the Egyptians were an entirely black people, that they flew in gliders and understood quantum mechanics. One of the sad parts of this is that multicultural curricula are important. We do need to appreciate the contributions that all the groups that make up our society have made. But this kind of curriculum gives all the other good ones, and there are some good ones. I think particularly the state of California that has a wonderful multicultural curriculum. This kind of thing puts the whole project under a cloud. The idea that what should be taught doesn't matter, the evidence doesn't matter, even makes its way into the popular culture. Oliver Stone's JFK is a perfect example. You don't need evidence, you don't need facts, you just want to set a myth out there. Someone asked Oliver Stone when he was at the National Press Club in Washington to identify, please, how JFK, how the film differed from propaganda. The interesting thing was not only did Stone not have an answer, he didn't seem troubled by not having an answer. So this is not just a phenomenon of the college and university campus. It's something that we all need to be aware about, that we all need to think about. And I'm happy to report that there are many good people on our campuses worrying about it, thinking about it. Benno Schmidt at Yale has been wonderfully outspoken on the topic. Harvard's Derek Bach, took him a while, but now he's speaking out about it. Stanford's John Searle has been eloquent. Howard University's Frank Snowden. Yale, I mentioned C. Van Woodward before. And I think as this discussion continues, I hope it will begin to include some notion of how it is we make teaching valued again. When I try to think how this has happened, when I try to think why teaching has become politicized, I sometimes wonder if it's because we have failed to make teaching as honored as it should be. And if you don't give people the sense that they're doing something fine and honorable and worth doing, they'll find some other way to give it meaning. And politics is another way. I came across an essay recently that brought home for me the importance of speaking out on issues like this. I'm constantly told by people that I shouldn't speak out on these things, that it doesn't do the reputation of colleges and universities any good for me to speak out this way. But this essay really helped me understand why I feel such a strong impulse to talk to audiences like this one. The author of this essay was a professor of women's studies, and she'd encountered certain feminist orthodoxies on campus, such as the idea that academic standards represent male values and women shouldn't be judged by them. So she noted that for a long time she'd hesitated to speak out because she didn't want to risk hurting feminism or women's studies. But then one day she said she realized that if no one speaks out, nothing gets better. She put it this way: everything that one tolerates that one shouldn't inevitably returns. I think these are very wise words, wise for all of us, and I thank you very much for giving me a chance to speak out today.
Thank you very much. As usual, we have time for a few questions, and we'd like to give our audiences a chance to participate here, asking their questions. Okay.
What to do about the problem of publish or perish? You have to address it across institutions. You can't do it at single institution by single institution. We have established a program, I set it up 3 years ago, called Distinguished Teaching Professorships. This is an opportunity for colleges, universities to apply for a great deal of money from the endowment, $300,000, to be matched on a 3-to-1 basis so that you end up with an endowment of $1.2 million, to be used to establish a chair for someone who has distinguished him or herself by teaching. And that chair's purpose will be to encourage teaching on that campus, to mentor good teaching, to stimulate and help with curriculum reform. By establishing those across the nation, we're doing a little part. The Department of Education, through the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, has a program to encourage curriculum reform among a bunch of colleges and universities at once, to bring a group together so that everybody's working on this, so that the whole value system begins to change. It's important that every institution work toward it, but those of us who have some ability need to try to work toward it on a national basis. It's basically a change in values. Well, say, I'm not sure you and I would agree. I think that would be an interesting idea to bring forth in class and discuss. It, for one thing, has a religious dimension to it. And I would hate the idea that non-sectarian colleges would become sectarian about religious matters, that there would be one attitude and it would involve belief, religious belief of some kind. I doubt that that's going on at very many colleges and universities. The smartest concept I've read has to do with portfolio evaluations, not letting any single source of evaluating teaching be totally dominant. Not student evaluation, for example, not peer evaluation, but let a whole source, a whole series of sources of evaluation come together in a portfolio. Might even include videotape of what's going on in class. But you're absolutely right. This whole question of peer evaluation is becoming very troubled. Where I see it is in political demands on who gets to do the evaluating. It is being said in some quarters, for example, that there can be no evaluation that goes on without a feminist on the evaluating committee. The idea being that no one else will appreciate feminist scholarship. I find the politicization of peer review as troubling as the politicization of the classroom. The American Association of Colleges has, the Association of American Colleges has a women's studies group that a few years ago put out a series of questions to be asked of people who were going to be hired or who were being looked at for jobs. There were questions like, what have you contributed to women's projects where you are now? What have you done to promote women who have worked for you? They're essentially political questions to be asked of people who are going to be hired. I cannot think of a greater threat to our colleges and universities in this politicization of who will be hired and who will advance.
And I might add, those questions might be asked to someone interviewing for a job as a physics professor.
Oh, exactly. They're to be asked across the board. I just saw a set from American University in Washington, D.C., across the board. I know that there are colleges in Ohio, some of whose administrators are here, where faculty are evaluated on gender sensitivity. I find this absolutely appalling. Have I scared you? Have I been too direct? And it's because I value higher education. I see one back here, too. That's a very good point. I know Rita Kramer makes this point that we've turned education into therapy, that we talk about it as though the goal were to make people feel good rather than as though the goal were to make people learn. I have been frankly astonished at the AAUW's last 3 or 4 years. Most women I know who are members of the American Association of University Women are very sensible, very well grounded. The reports that are now coming out of AAUW are buying into a lot of radical feminist theory that is astonishing, such as the idea that men and women are so different that we can't evaluate women by the same standards that we have always used. I find this so completely sexist a notion that it offends me. But the latest AAUW publications are all buying into this. It's almost as though what's happened to the AAUW is what's happened to my church, Methodist Church. Everybody I know who's a Methodist is a good, commonsensical person, well-grounded, but the Methodist Church, when it speaks in Washington, is off the charts. Similarly with the AAUW, most of the people are essentially well-grounded, but now the people who seem to be in charge of putting out publications are off the charts.
I think we have time for one more.
A national core curriculum at our colleges and universities, I don't think I would think it was a good idea. Partly because one of the strengths of American higher education is its diversity. And you see that as a strength when you begin to worry about politics in the classroom. There are campuses that have completely resisted this. And they've been able to do it by defining their own mission. What's been worrisome about the fact that certain accrediting groups have now become politicized, and they are now looking at colleges and universities in terms of whether they're politically correct or not, is that you will drive everyone toward a single standard. It seems to me that the diversity of higher education is what has made it possible for colleges and universities, for really well-grounded ones, to escape this phenomenon.
Thank you.
Cliff, thank you. It's been a
very
pleasure
much.
to be here.